Jake and I definitely appreciate the opportunity to come before this board tonight and talk to you all about everything that we've been up to over the past several months. We've greatly appreciated having the participation both of staff as well as members of the public and those that have borne with us through all of our steering committees and stakeholder interactions that we've had throughout this process. So it's really been a highly interactive process. We've gotten a lot of great feedback, so we certainly appreciate that anytime that we do one of these plans when we get that level of feedback. So as Stephen said, what we're going to be doing tonight is just giving you the framework of what you'll be seeing in the 3 volumes that we have that compose the town plan. So just give you a little bit of overview of how we went about this process to kind of start things off, and then we'll basically go in order. Our 3 volumes are an introductory volume, our 2nd volume is for the Comprehensive Growth Management Plan, and our 3rd volume is for transportation. So you'll hear from me to just tee things up. I'll kick it over to Jake for a little while, and then it'll come back to me to chat about transportation. So this has been a community-driven planning process. What you see here is really what we were charged with at the outset of this process to establish a vision for transportation and land use in Smithfield. Again, a lot of kudos to the town for electing to do these simultaneously. Oftentimes, we're doing a transportation plan that is responsive to a growth management plan that's already been completed, or vice versa. It really does have a lot of advantages to do the 2 simultaneously because they are so interwoven. Our transportation decisions are very dependent on land use and vice versa. So at the end of this, we're also trying to get to something that's actionable for you. This is not a plan that will sit on the shelf. This is something that will help guide the decision making for this group and for the town as a whole into the future. Just a brief overview of our schedule that we've been a part of through this process. You'll see 4 major phases here. We started off with an initiation phase to help people understand what it was that we were doing and start to get some of that initial feedback and vision from the public, and for us to familiarize ourselves with the town as well. We moved into a greater understanding of what current conditions currently are and understanding what tools we had available to us from a data standpoint and also from a previous planning standpoint. That allowed us to move into really starting to establish the visioning and the goals of what we were attempting to achieve out of the town plan, and then ultimately translate into the development of some of the key milestones from this planning effort, which would include the future land use map and those transportation recommendations. We're here at the final portion of this process now. As we near the adoption, we do have a draft plan that has been completed and is available for review, which is what we'll be teeing up today. And then we'll have the opportunity to revisit that with you all again. Just as a reminder, what we're talking about with our study area here actually includes the entire town limits of Smithfield as well as the ETJ, the full planning boundary for the area. So we're looking at that entire area when we start to make some of these decisions. It's been very important for us to work with some of our agency partners, whether that be NCDOT, whether that be the Rural Planning Organization that you all belong to, or the other groups and departments within the town itself to make sure that we have a holistic understanding of what all is going to be at stake here. Our public input process, as Stephen mentioned, we've tried as much as we can to really let this be a fully unified process. So we've come to the public with both the Comprehensive Growth Management Plan and the Transportation Plan action items, gathering feedback in a consistent and unified way throughout this process. We had the opportunity to have quite a bit of interaction with the public, including things like 6 focus groups as a part of our stakeholder interview process, which are really kind of more intensive sit-downs to learn a little bit more information about a particular topic. We were in attendance at the Ham and Yam Festival in 2018, where we got some nice feedback from folks just giving us some initial impressions about their vision for the town. Our first public workshop had 70 attendees. It's a really healthy number for this type of a planning study, so we're very pleased to see that. And it was complemented by a survey that ran at the same time where we asked some similar questions and got a little bit more information from folks. We had 189 unique participants as a part of that survey, which amounted to over 1,200 data points, so lots of great information for us to digest. Our second public workshop was held just a little bit earlier this year in February, and we had 40 attendees for that second workshop on hand to view some of our recommendations and draft findings. And then a second online survey came online about that time. Very strong participation in this one as well, with 175 unique participants.
Chief, I want to ask a question. Did you have a lot of repeats at the public workshops from the previous ones?
We did. We had some, definitely some folks that stuck with us throughout the process, but we also had new folks that were being introduced within it. So it was nice to see that blend.
Yes, ma'am. Excuse me. Sorry.
No, absolutely. One of the things that we did as part of our initial public input process was really starting to understand, as a means to develop our vision and goals for the area, what people were envisioning their town to look like on into the future. One of the things we did just to help clarify this was looking at things like a visual preference survey. That's where we look at representative images that may reference certain types of land uses or certain types of transportation features, and have people weigh in on what things were most interesting to them. And by putting some of these things together and pairing them with other questions that we asked either in person or through our survey, we really started to gain a clearer understanding of what everyone was truly interested in as part of this process, which we'll go into in just a moment. So again, just a reminder, this is a 3-volume setup. Again, as an opportunity to try to keep this as unified as possible, we do have that introductory volume. It really just sets the stage, provides a lot of the background in terms of existing conditions, both from a land use and transportation perspective. It does provide an overview from our community engagement process. So it's something that just is a nice initial introductory piece that helps people understand the background that we use to come to volumes 2 and 3. So volume 2, as I mentioned, the comprehensive growth management strategy, and then our volume 3 transportation recommendations, which we'll now discuss in further detail. So I'll turn things over to Jake.
Thank you, Ms. Floyd. That was, I mean, at least we know which direction we're going, you know, and with the basis of your information. So I really look forward to it, to be honest with you. Yes, ma'am.
So we're going to jump into the comprehensive growth management plan update, and you know, some of this is a little bit of background, and then kind of get into these recommendations. Part of this is just thinking about a vision for the town, and a lot of this came from conversations with the steering committee. We had a very active steering committee that has met 8 times. A first couple meetings were really around issue identification. So understanding, okay, what are the big issues that need to be addressed in town? That was augmented with what we heard from the public and the survey. And then we kind of transitioned from, okay, these are the big issues. Well, what's the vision and what's some of the goals to kind of address some of the issues and really get towards that vision? So this is kind of a working vision that came out of the plan. Smithfield will be a place of opportunity for everyone. It will grow in ways that are true to its history, character, and charm by investing in a vibrant downtown and connections to the river, balancing growth, and creating safe, healthy neighborhoods. So you see that there's a lot in there, a lot of things related to, you know, economic development and downtown and kind of what makes Smithfield great and what we can build on, right? What are some of the strengths that we can build on and some things that we want to see in the future. And then from that vision, there's a little bit more detail in some of the goals in the plan about, you know, how to address certain aspects of that vision. So we came up with 5 overarching goals. You can kind of read about them in the plan, but I'll touch on them briefly in this presentation. So balanced growth is one, so that's economic growth, but also balancing growth with existing neighborhoods and the environment. Vibrant downtown, just downtown came up over and over again. It's one of your greatest assets. It's really something that sets you apart from other places in Johnson County, and it's really something that we wanted to focus on a little bit. Healthy neighborhoods as well. So that has to do with healthy lifestyles, but also neighborhood stability, and we'll get into that a little bit more. Community character. So this is really what builds your town's identity, and what things kind of look like, and how the town is perceived by residents and visitors, and that sort of thing. And then Move and Connect, which is really about a balanced transportation system. So I'm going to be primarily focused on the first four, and then Allison will talk more about that transportation goal. So a big part of this plan is the future land use plan. And you have a handout in front of you, and this future land use map really illustrates the intended growth pattern for the town. So each color represents a particular character area that is described kind of on the left-hand margin. And in those character areas, it talks about kinds of uses that should be allowed, and the scale of development, the intensity of development, and it should change between each of those character areas. And then also has some design recommendations. So as you read this document, you will see that there are particular policies that are related to individual character areas. And this is a good thing to have handy as you kind of cruise through the document. But really, this map is really meant to be used by you all quite a bit moving forward after it's adopted. This is meant to provide guidance for rezoning decisions. If something comes before you and it's a change in current zoning and new development, ideally you should look to this to say, is this in line with the plan, or is this not in line with the plan? It should also guide private investment, because we took into account where utilities likely should be in the future and that sort of thing. So it should guide kind of where people invest from the private sector as well. And then also town services. So where should we provide town services? Where does it make sense? Where can and should growth go? So that's something that will be really handy kind of and a useful tool for you all down the line. This is the map. I'll point out a couple things here, and we can kind of get into more details if y'all have questions and that sort of thing. But some of the things that we wanted to do was make sure that we balance land uses. So we wanted to make sure we had enough land for industrial and employment growth. Those areas are in purple on the map. So you see a lot of area out towards the airport, down towards 70 and Brightleaf, and then also south on Brightleaf as well, a little bit on the east side of town near the railroad tracks, where office and higher density residential should go. That's the blue area. And then a number of commercial and mixed use areas where we want to encourage different types of commercial growth. And then we also treated the downtown a little differently in that we identified a core area, then also a supportive area on the east and south side, and then we have some land use recommendations around those areas. From a residential perspective, we wanted to distinguish between where more medium density or smaller lot subdivisions should go, and then also where more traditional larger lot suburban or even rural areas. So those are the three categories: the medium density, the low density, and then the rural residential areas. And then the conservation area is largely the 100-year floodplain, which is a significant feature on the landscape that I'm sure you all are familiar with. So that's an overview of the map, and I'm going to talk about some individual areas a little bit more as we talk about balanced growth. So one of the things that we really try to focus on is identifying and taking advantage of economic development opportunities. So encouraging a diverse tax base is really critical, because studies have shown that a lot of residential, unless it's really high value residential, really doesn't pay for the types of services that it needs. Police, fire, schools, all these things. So understanding how we can reserve land for manufacturing and office and retail and restaurants is important, but also it's a balance too, because we want to make sure that the commercial areas we do have are really healthy, and there's not an oversupply or underutilized land and that sort of thing. So we are documenting kind of where we want to support rezonings to those non-residential and mixed-use areas on the future land use map. And then we're also saying where we want to kind of discourage some commercial rezonings and that sort of thing, where there's not really good access and it might end up being underutilized property down the line, or kind of not adding value, but kind of siphoning some of the kind of energy away from some of these other centers that we really want to do well. So those are two things that we want to accomplish there. One of the things that we think is a real economic development opportunity is really the vacant shopping centers that you all do have on the west side of town. It was also identified as one of the big issues initially, that we have a couple shopping centers that are largely vacant, and the first thing you see as you come into town. But on the flip side, they are also an opportunity. It's very rare that you have a piece of land that has already been kind of partially developed or graded and prepped really for development, that size and those key locations that have really good transportation access and access to utilities and that sort of thing. So we are encouraging the redevelopment of those vacant shopping centers. This is actually a conceptual design of something that could fit on the vacant parcel just next to Heavener. So right now there's an empty building there, or partially empty and utilized for storage. But we could see, these mixed-use centers really transition from just solely underutilized commercial into some commercial with some mix of housing on it as well. So this is one of the things that we're really thinking through, and how we can provide some flexible zoning standards to encourage that sort of redevelopment and take advantage of those opportunities. The northern gateway area, which is really the area Buffalo Road over to Booker Dairy Road and then US 70, is also an area where we think there's a lot of opportunity for economic development. So up against US 70, we are recommending a mixed-use center, some office, maybe some light manufacturing or light industrial in there if it's designed appropriately, and then transitioning to medium density as you kind of come away from the interstate or the highway there. Then you also have a mixed-use node at Buffalo and Booker Dairy with some office institutional around there. One thing that we think is critical here is roadway connections. So we do have some proposed and planned collector streets that break up that area and provide access. One change to this map that's not reflected is per the most recent steering committee meeting. It was decided to add a little commercial node right at the intersection of Kelly Drive and Buffalo Road. That's reflected on this big map we have here, but it's not on your map. But that's part of taking advantage of those economic development opportunities, and thinking that's going to be a pretty big intersection, and there's going to be a draw there. We wanted to take advantage of that. A couple other things we're thinking about when we're making some recommendations related to economic development is make sure that there's compatible development adjacent to Johnson Regional Airport. That is a great resource, and it's only going to grow. It did receive some grant funds from the state, and we think it's a real asset. The other thing that we want to do is coordinate with Johnson County Public Schools and make sure that the town has an open dialogue with them, and they're doing anything, we're doing everything we can to kind of support their mission and improve schools and offer curriculum that local businesses can benefit from long term, and JCC can benefit from as well. Another thing about balanced growth is balancing the type of residential that we are going to get in our town. We had a survey where participants indicated there was a lot of interest in different types of housing options that are currently available and currently for sale in the market. 51% of respondents said they wanted a house with a large yard, even if it's not near shopping or services. But 45% said A low-maintenance patio home or townhome near shopping and services would be of interest to them. And then 43% said a house with a smaller yard within walking distance of a school or park. So those two middle ones, the kind of small lot patio home or townhome, and then the smaller yard, is really something that we call the missing middle. So we have a lot of kind of really, especially in bigger cities, you have a lot of like condos and apartments and higher density stuff, and then you have a lot of homes with larger lots, but not a lot of in the middle product. And here you all have some apartments, even relatively new apartments out on the west side, and then you have some larger lot homes and neighborhoods, but you don't have a lot in between. So especially for young adults that are graduating from school or graduating from JCC, they might not want a house with a large yard. Similarly, you all have a really older population, and I think we heard some of their preferences in this survey. So you have a higher median age than Johnson County and a lot of other towns, and a lot of retirees are looking for something that's a little bit more low maintenance than, say, a house with a half acre or acre yard. So this is something we're thinking about, and we also have a lot of recommendations related to the design of these kind of more medium density or slightly higher density products, because design becomes really important when you do allow for more higher density stuff. Another prong of the balanced growth idea is environmental protection. So respecting areas historically impacted by floods is a big one. And you all kind of know this well from Matthew and all the damage that was done with that event. So thinking about it proactively and limiting uses and density, especially in undeveloped areas, restricting fill and considering additional structure elevation to limit property value damage, because this is your tax base. Essentially, something that's built in the floodplain is your tax base, so you're going to rely on that. So you kind of want to protect it. You want to, it's in the town interests to make sure it's as resilient as possible. And then also just thinking about the floodplain as an amenity. Especially in new residential development. What can you do in the floodplain? What should you encourage to be done in the floodplain in terms of recreation, in terms of reserving it as open space? So that was balanced growth. Moving into the vibrant downtown recommendations, one of the big things that we wanted to recommend and encourage is active uses on the ground floor frontages of downtown, especially near kind of the epicenter of downtown, Market Street and 3rd Street. Encouraging adaptive reuse and infill of older buildings or vacant or underutilized properties in and around downtown, with some design standards, of course, to make sure it fits in the historical character of downtown. But then there's also a lot of kind of edges of downtown, especially the east side and to a lesser degree the south side, that could be an interesting area to allow some of that missing middle housing, different kinds of housing, townhomes or smaller apartments, that sort of thing. And we are recommending a new overlay or new zoning district to encourage some different kinds of development that currently can be allowed in there in order to kind of spur some investment and really get some new market rate housing within walking distance to downtown, because I think that there is a demand for it. We heard it in the stakeholder interviews. There's a lot of people proactively renovating homes in and around downtown because people want to be here. So adding new product to these renovations really could be a way to get more people downtown more often. That could help out downtown restaurants, other businesses downtown, and really appeal to a broader demographic as well, as people are looking to move back to Smithfield or looking for somewhere that that has some of the things that Smithfield has and other places don't. Also preserving the historic character of kind of downtown, the business district, but then also the historic neighborhoods, especially North Smithfield and then to the south. Thinking about how to allow some investment, encourage some investment there, but also respect the character is really important. Promotion and programming downtown. You all do a really good job of this, and the Downtown Development Corporation has done a great job on this, but just continuing to do that. continuing events and programming and marketing downtown, highlighting local businesses in marketing material, but also specifically even from the Greenway. That's another thing. So connecting downtown to users of the Greenway that might not know. They might be going on the Greenway, but they might not know that there's a really awesome downtown and 12 restaurants, you know, just a hop, skip, and jump away from the Greenway. So making that connection a little bit is good, and supporting the food and beverage cluster as well. And pedestrian experience is also really important in and around downtown, making it encouraging, make it comfortable to walk to where people don't just want to come and go to one place, but they want to come and go to multiple places, stroll around. They're willing to bring their family, even when there's not an event. That sort of thing is something that we heard a lot about. Collaborating and identifying areas for public art, and then also working to manage parking is a big thing. So working with the county, town, and businesses to make sure that we're getting the most out of the parking resources we have available, off-street and then also on-street parking. Healthy neighborhoods. One of the big recommendations is complete the Mountains of Sea Trail through Smithfield, and then consider some extensions or connections from the main trail. And then we also have some recommendations around maintaining and improving parks specifically. This is kind of a map of the Mountains to Sea Trail and the Neuse River Greenway as it traverses through Smithfield. A section that's the solid section right here from Smithfield Community Park and Shrek down along Buffalo Creek and down into downtown. That is completed and it's very well used. But connecting it northward from the Smithfield Community Park up to Clayton is a really high priority for the state, and also I think it should be for the town. And then, you know, further connections and some options that we have to look at on the south, kind of into South Smithfield, and then also out across the Neuse River and into kind of outside of the jurisdiction of the town. One of the things that we looked at is the economic impact of greenways in Smithfield and the potential in Smithfield. So it's estimated that with future expansion to Clayton, trail users on the Neuse River Greenway could potentially generate $1 million in business revenues annually. And there's a specific study that was done as part of this to estimate that, and it's going to be located in the appendix of the plan. But you know, this is not necessarily just for recreation. A lot of towns are embracing the idea of trails and greenways because of the economic benefits. And you're really ideally located on the trail because you're far enough from Clayton to where if people say people bike all the way down here, which many will do. Many people bike between Clayton and the Neuse River Dam, Falls Lake Dam all the time. But if we connect the trail to Clayton, you're far enough away to where if people take the trouble to bike all the way down here, they're going to stop and eat. They're going to come downtown and buy something, go to shops, go to the museum, go to the History Museum or Ava Gardner Museum or something. And many, if the option is available, will stay the night. So thinking about lodging options, thinking about other recreational activities that you can use to make people or want to linger a little bit more and do multiple things is really important, and that's how that $1 million could be generated annually. The other thing we're looking at is how to increase access to healthy food and strengthen neighborhoods, so addressing vacancies and conducting code enforcement activities, but also understanding where we can provide affordable housing, so coordinating with affordable housing builders and thinking about neighborhood improvements too. One thing that came up a lot in the issue identification from the steering committee and also from the public is your gateway corridors. So these main corridors that come into town, so primarily Market Street and 301. These images were submitted by a steering committee member. They had a homework assignment early on to tell us take pictures of some things they really like about town and then some things that need care and attention. And these were some images that came of some corridors that from underutilized commercial properties. So one of the recommendations we have is some design standards for key entry corridors. You do have a commercial corridor overlay district, but it's not customized for Market Street and for 301. So it makes it really hard for Stephen to make recommendations on how different sites and design of sites should happen on those, because they're not necessarily context appropriate recommendations for both corridors. So we do have some recommendations, suggested standards in the action plan of the plan that it could be a way to jumpstart and a kind of a template for updating that commercial corridor overlay district. And that might be one of the things you all can talk about after we adopt the plan. What kinds of modifications to the UDO are appropriate in order to accomplish some of the things that are recommended in this plan. But the goal here is there's not a silver bullet. There's not one thing we can do overnight to clean up your entry corridors and your gateways, but it can happen incrementally. And the UDO is the best tool we have. We have some policy recommendations, some design recommendations in this plan, but really, think about in the long term, think about incrementally how can we make minor modifications through redevelopment and upfit to improve these corridors, and that is a big recommendation in the plan. One of the corridor sections we really looked at was east of the railroad tracks in front of JCC campus. So right now you have about 3 blocks on the north side of Market Street that are vacant. Actually, like these 3 blocks are completely vacant, 3 or 4. But thinking about how new development could be situated there, how it could be a new gateway into town, but also into JCC. What could potentially go there? It could have a mix of some commercial and some retail, but also maybe there's a place for some single-family homes behind, and then also a mix of housing product that could appeal to some JCC students or faculty and be within walking distance of JCC. So that's a kind of a conceptual level take and kind of a site fit to see what could go there. Also, preserving historic assets in downtown and surrounding neighborhoods, and stormwater came up a lot, and you all see it, whenever there's a big rain right across the street. Some of the stormwater in and around downtown, and then also in East Smithfield, needs to have some maintenance or some upfit. And as far as improvements go, considering gray, which is new pipes or curb inlets or that sort of thing, making sure the sizes and the drainage is as good as possible, that can solve it. But also some green infrastructure improvements. Green infrastructure improvements is, how can we encourage infiltration instead of just conveyance? So how can we build rain gardens or stormwater planters or take out some impervious surface in order to encourage and give that water somewhere to go that's not necessarily in our stormwater system. Those are some ideas there. Thinking about open space in new residential development, it came up. A lot of the visual preference images that folks selected and said they want to see more, have trees in it. They have more types of open space. So thinking about how we can bring our standards up to peer communities, specifying criteria to get usable open space and conserve natural features. And then also, thinking about, if we are going to allow those higher density, smaller lots and multifamily in different places, how can we design them appropriately to make sure that they add value to the community? And updating some street standards and subdivision standards could be part of this. Treating urban areas and suburban areas different than rural areas, and making sure that our street sections and that sort of thing that we're having folks build is appropriate, considering where sidewalks are required, where street or yard trees are required or allowed, that sort of thing is part of it. And that's the growth management plan so far.
Thank you. I would just like to comment on one of your pictures up there of the suggested demolishing of one of the buildings. It has been done. so I just thought I'd pass that on to the board.
Oh.
It's in the top right-hand corner, right there. That's no longer there.
Oh, great.
Yes, it is great.
Incremental progress.
Well, I just want to let you know I was paying attention.
That's great. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right, I'm back.
Good.
So now that you've kind of heard where we are from a growth management standpoint, you're going to start to see a lot of overlap and a lot of parallels in what I'm going to be talking about from a transportation standpoint. But just to kind of set the stage, whenever we do a transportation plan update in a community, the first thing that we're trying to do ties in with this vision and goals. We're really interested to understand what do people perceive as the biggest issue from a transportation standpoint in the community. And it tells us a lot about where we should be focusing our attention. And interestingly, when we came here, lots of places they'll say congestion, 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 and also congestion. We did hear about some congestion. There are definitely some areas that experience some problems. But what we heard even more of was safety. Safety is a concern at our intersections along some of our busy roads. For pedestrians, we heard a lot about bicycling. We heard a lot about walking. I'd really like to be able to walk in or to downtown. I really wish I could get over to Shrek a little bit easier, or get over to JCC for my classes, or over to the outlet mall. So we heard a lot about multimodal accommodations. And then we also heard a lot about character, which comes back to some of the other vision and goals that you've already heard. Hey, when we're putting together, I don't just want some ugly road out there. I'd like to have something that actually makes sense with some of the things that Jake has been talking about when we are developing or redeveloping an area, doing something that's just going to be more in keeping with the character. So we're going to go through a series of our recommendations and how we've tried to respond to some of those things through the next few slides here. So when we start to think about how do we get between land use and transportation, those feel like they can be pretty separate topics. So what we felt like we needed was, I always think about the Rosetta Stone that had the Egyptian, Greek, and Roman stuff all on the same tablet so people could understand. We need a translation table that tells us, when we're talking about this kind of land use stuff, this is what our streets need to be doing to help respond to that. So we created what's called a street typology. It sounds probably fancier and more exotic than it really is. The whole intent here is to help us look at what Jake and his group have been helping to define in terms of our proposed land uses, boil that down into some simpler categories. We don't need quite the level of granularity that we see in the land use plan, but things like, what do we consider urban? What do we consider suburban? And what do we consider to be rural? Because in general, I wonder if we're still recording. We'll find out. In general, all of those are going to have slightly different characteristics that we're going to be most focused on. When we start to talk about transportation, we start to talk about trade-offs. Many of your roads have stuff on either side of them, surprisingly or not surprisingly. And oftentimes, if we built out the ideal section that everyone wanted to have with, extra lanes and sidewalks on both sides, and let's stick some bike lanes on there, maybe a greenway, well, we've just busted through the stuff that we actually wanted to build all of this to accommodate all of the properties on either side. So it's going to come down to trade-offs. The street typology helps us understand in some of those certain environments, what should we be most interested in? What should we be focusing our attention on? So for instance, in an urban environment, our bicycling and pedestrian is probably going to have a higher priority than in the suburban and certainly in the rural context areas. We have a higher density of our population. We have more destination points that folks are trying to get to. And so we need to think about that when we're trading off between, with our available space, what can we really fit in? So we have a series of tables. This is just an example, but they're all included in the plan, that helped us boil this down from an urban, suburban, and rural perspective, what we were trying to do for our arterial level streets, our higher level streets, the collectors, which are kind of those middle ground 2 to maybe 3 lane streets, and then our local streets. This is something that ultimately we can take alongside some of the things coming out of the land use plan and translate it into your street design guide. That would be kind of a next step after this planning process, to just distill that all into there. That way all of the planning documents are kind of on the same page, and if you have a developer come in, or if you are looking at redevelopment yourself, it's very easy to reference back and forth between them. So that's kind of where we started. We needed to get our lay of the land. And after that, we could start to understand where our deficiencies were from a roadway perspective. So when we start to talk about roadway recommendations, you'll see a blend of different recommendation types. I know that oftentimes when we think about, what am I going to do to the road? Well, I'm going to widen the road, right? Well, and that's certainly an option. We do have widening proposed in a couple of different locations in the community, and we do have new roadways proposed in a couple of different locations in the community as well. But one of the things that is a reality in the world of transportation is the availability of funding, or more to the point, the lack of available funding for transportation projects. We have a lot of NCDOT roads in this community. Most places do in North Carolina. It's something that makes us a little bit unique as a state, that we have so many state-owned and maintained roads. As a result, we're working with NCDOT regularly. Y'all are communicating with them, what are our priorities? Where do we need to have this attention focused? But guess what? At the end of the day, they've got a certain amount of funds. Hopefully, we're making as good a case as we can to utilize those funds. So as a result, when we start to think about what types of projects we want to bring forward, we don't just want to focus on some of those high dollar, high impact projects. Those are great. We definitely want to keep those on the radar screen and press them forward wherever we can. But we need to balance those out with things like smaller scale improvements at intersections. Oftentimes, if you have a capacity problem, you've got congestion on a road, you can actually add a couple turn lanes at a couple intersections and fix that capacity problem, because it's not a problem when you're free flow, it's a problem when you get to the traffic signal. So we want to make sure that we're keeping those in mind. Also, from an intersection perspective, that's the place where we can have the biggest bang for our buck, many times from a safety standpoint as well. So those are where most of our big crashes are coming. We looked at crashes both in terms of how frequent our crashes were and how severe that they were. We needed to make sure we were kind of looking at it from both sides of the coin there, which is why you'll see intersection improvements in some of the usual suspect corridors. You see several on 301, you see several on US 70 Business, but you also see some a little bit further out. And oftentimes, some of the ones that you're seeing in a more rural type area are going to have a larger degree of severity, which is why they've been identified as an area needing improvement. We also have access and operations type projects. Now, when I talk about an access or operations type project, I'm talking about something like adding a median to a road, looking at driveway consolidation for neighboring developments as they redevelop. Things like that can actually work within the curb lines, and because you're not busting up that curb line, because you're not taking any of that adjacent property, it's a lot less expensive and oftentimes can have a pretty significant impact. So we want to make sure that we are identifying opportunities for that where it exists. And finally, modernization. This is something that I think we're seeing more and more of when we do these community plans, that oftentimes you have a road that's working all right. From a traffic perspective, it's not exceeding the limits that we would expect it to have, but gosh, if we could just get a foot of paved shoulder on the side, or if we could get an edge line so that every time a truck runs over that road that the pavement does not deteriorate, or every time somebody maybe needs to, they go a little bit off track, they need to correct, they have the space to do that without running into a ditch. That's what we're talking about in terms of modernization. Modernization can also include turn lanes at a new development, so it doesn't exclude any of those types of things, but it's really just kind of bringing the road up to the standard we'd like to see it operating at. So you'll see a big mix of all those different types of projects along here. We also have and devote kind of a special focus to our collector streets. So collector streets, we really think about them in a unique way because they're not something most of the time that you guys or the town is going to be paying for. In limited occasions, there is a huge desire for a critical piece of connectivity that is maybe missing, but most of the time this is going to be developer driven. So these lines here, we really are focused on endpoints when we talk about collector streets. What does it connect to and what does it connect from? I'm maybe less concerned about what that alignment looks like in the way. I'd like to provide the developer or developers that come into that area as much flexibility as possible to have that road kind of work within what they're trying to do. Jake showed you an example. Where's the little laser thing on here?
Middle.
Middle, aha. Jake showed you this example in one of his focus areas. Those are a couple of the collector street locations that were identified that would correspond with how the land uses in that area could develop. So that's really what we're looking at. We look at, all of these are things that can be done. We don't try to span a river with a collector street. We need to be realistic. We need this to be something that's buildable by a developer that comes in as well. But those connections take a lot of pressure off your bigger roads. They provide folks that come into those areas with a greater opportunity for egress and ingress. And oftentimes, they're some of the better places for a bicyclist or a pedestrian to be, because it's a lower speed, lower volume road. Now, we had our own version of the focus areas. Jake mentioned a couple as part of the Comprehensive Growth Management Plan, and we focused on a few corridors or spot locations instead, and just wanted to call your attention to those. As one of the focus areas in the Growth Management Plan, you did look at the segment from the railroad tracks up past the JCC, close to where the Outlet Mall area would begin, and just starting to understand what could be done in that area. So when Jake was starting to put that together, he and I had to talk and say, well, what is this road going to have to look like in the future? And what we're seeing when we start to look at the volumes that are out there now and how we think they could grow in the future is that this may be a segment of road that eventually needs to be a 4-lane roadway, a 4-lane divided. And I'm talking about the extents between 301 all the way up to I-95 and maybe a little bit beyond, depending on what happens on that eastern side. This is a unique area. We actually have 2 recommendations on this particular segment. It's the only one in the whole plan that we have 2 separate recommendations for, because we see this as potentially a phased recommendation. We think we can do some interim stuff now with access management, things like fixing up some of those intersections, maybe looking at turn lanes or restricting turns in certain locations to make it a little bit more safe, and to get as much life out of the road as we can before we actually have to widen it. Widening this, spoiler alert, is going to be expensive because we have this beautiful bridge right here. Now that bridge is an old bridge, the current bridge that's there now. It is a railroad bridge. Railroad bridges typically have a little bit longer life than a highway bridge, so it's not necessarily to the point that it's so old that we're looking at, you know, how soon does this need to get replaced. We also know there's flooding issues in that area, and having this and actually raising up the overall height of that bridge so that we can raise the street level somewhat would help alleviate a lot of those things. And that's what we tried to focus on when we looked at this full build out and full vision. We also see this as a nice way to underscore some of what Jake was telling you about letting this truly be a gateway into the downtown area. So it's important, even though this may be 10 years, 20 years down the road, to go ahead and get these types of concepts out there if the town is interested in them, because this is an NCDOT road. This is going to continue to come up and be evaluated in different ways, and more funding or different types of funding may come available. So it's better to be prepared. And then just pointing out a couple final things here. We have a sidewalk on one side of the road, and then this is a shared use path, which is essentially just a greenway on the side of the road, about a 10-foot wide path for bicyclists and for pedestrians. We debated long and hard about which side we should be putting our shared use path on. There's a lot of destination points on either side of the road in this location, but the main thing we're really focused on is having that connection over or under, in this case, the railroad track, because it is a barrier for our walkers and bikers right now. One of our other focused areas was Brightleaf Boulevard. Some of y'all may be able to place this. This is North Brightleaf. There's the Hardee's. So Taco Bell is, I think, there. There's McDonald's. Chick-fil-A is back that way. This is one of our access and operations corridors. So just to give you an example of what we're talking about when we talk about access management, what you'll see here is there's currently a center turn lane there right now. In many places, when we start to look at that portion of the corridor, there are frequent driveways, or there's even business entrances that don't really have a driveway. It's just an open section where you can kind of go in wherever you want. That's something that is a little bit more unpredictable. So when I think about this, put my safety hat on, I don't know where you're going to turn. When you get into a center turn lane, I'm not sure if you're turning at this driveway, the next driveway, the next driveway. The introduction of a median helps to correct that problem because now you're turning at a predictable location. Now, of course, it does limit access, direct access for certain folks, but what we find on corridors like this is there's a sensitivity point where I just don't like going down that road because I don't feel safe. And we run into that in many locations. Typically, these 5-lane sections are our usual suspects that have this type of development on them. So it just gives a measure of predictability. You'll also see sidewalks on both sides. And this is a fun addition. That's one of the gateway signs that this is the approved design that y'all are actually moving forward with. So it's exciting to have that kind of on the horizon. And then our number one comment getter, Outlet Center Drive Roundabout. Far and away, our number one vote getter in terms of safety and people just not liking it. We actually had a question at our first public workshop, and we looked at a couple different schematics. We had the roundabout the way it is. We had a modified roundabout that's hopefully a little bit more intuitive, and we had a traffic signal. And we asked people to vote, tell us which one they preferred. And in a little bit of a surprising, at least to me, outcome, the answer was, I don't care as long as it's not the existing. Do anything else.
That was a good answer.
I just rolled out the map a couple days ago and saw the comments on there that said anything but this. So what we tried to do is we did a little bit more in-depth analysis for this. We did look at, we actually gathered some traffic counts, what's out there right now, started to understand, we even projected that out into the future, just to look at growth. Understand what can we do to make this a little bit more predictable. So I just want to hit a couple quick highlights on this, because at first glance they look similar. They're both using that roundabout, which we elected to preserve the roundabout instead of the signal for a couple reasons. A, it's significantly cheaper because you're working primarily with pavement you've already got on the ground. Second off, there's no chance for a backup out onto I-95 or onto US 70 business because as a traffic signal would actually cause a stoppage, whereas a roundabout, there is not a stoppage. Everybody's going to continue on. So that was very important to our DOT partners, and we have to be very sensitive to that. So when we look about this, the differences here, one of the big things that we'll see are in the placement of the medians. One of the big comments that we received here was that Smithfield Crossing Drive, as y'all most likely can visualize in your mind. If you're heading north, there are 2 lanes headed north. There's a median in between the 2 northbound lanes. That does cause confusion for some folks. It's not typical to have a median between lanes that are going the same direction. So oftentimes we'll have folks coming up here and say, well, I wanted to go to Zaxby's. I'm going to make my U-turn and go do that. And they get run into by the guy that was going the same direction as they were. So, easy fix, move the median, so that the 2 lanes going in the same direction are separated from the lane going in the other direction. You still have that opening. It's a little bit more intuitive. People can actually get in whichever lane they want to be in, and then they can turn over onto Smithfield Crossing Drive. Similarly, over here, we eliminated this additional median that it currently exists that kind of channels folks all the way over to the furthest center, the furthest portion of the outlet center. So that folks can make an earlier decision. They may want to turn at Equity Drive. They may want to access some of the hotels in that area, or they may want to turn back around because they want to go to Zaxby's. So we have that ability now. We believe that there's space enough, the volumes work for this, that we can make that work with a little bit less confusion for folks coming into that area. We would preserve signage there, just noting that there's no access onto I-95. That actually does a pretty good job right now. We never heard any complaints from folks about being confused about whether they could get on there, so we'd keep that. Add some overhead signage. That was a big discussion at our most recent steering committee meeting, so that folks can understand, where am I supposed to be? What is this doing? Mostly for the folks trying to get back on I-95 to help them understand, because it does feel a little counterintuitive to go farther away in order to get back on. So having that signage is going to be important. So, and then the only other thing that I did not mention is just adding some additional lane markings as you come off of 70 Business or I-95 to help you understand which lane that you should get into when you get into that roundabout. So this is something that ultimately would need to be thought about and executed by the town.
You're also removing the median sooner.
Yes.
Before the roundabout.
That's correct. There is a chance for people to make a decision before they enter the roundabout. That is a new feature that is not currently there. So, yeah, we hope that this removes some of the confusion. It turns it into really what, if anyone has driven another roundabout, it seems a little bit more comfortable. It seems a little bit more familiar. The decision points are more straightforward. To be able to get into the lane that they ultimately want to get into, or in case they get into the wrong lane, to correct that sooner and more safely. So that's what we were trying to aim for on that. So I know I spent a lot of time on that one, but it's been a hot topic throughout the development of this. But I also want to transition over to focus on pedestrians. This was definitely a big priority for us. You've already heard from Jake about some of the benefits that we think can happen as a result of the Greenway extension. One of the things that we wanted to do here is, you all already have standards in place for new development or for redevelopment for sidewalks being constructed along the sides of the road. We think that what you have in place is doing a good job. We think that that's something that we can continue forward with. So what we really wanted to do was identify areas where we feel that it is of particular importance to focus on the pedestrian accommodations. And that can mean a couple of things. That can mean, as you're looking at, again, that trade-off of space. What goes, what stays in my limited cross-section that I have. These are going to be areas where we feel like pedestrians should be given a higher seat at that table. Or perhaps in some instances, we may even want to look at a sidewalk and a side path, which is, again, the greenway along the side of the road. So we looked at this in a couple different ways. First, from a community-driven perspective, which includes things like anywhere around a school, we need to be really mindful of pedestrian accommodations. Those connections to the greenway that Jake mentioned to you, connections to downtown, JCC, Johnston Health, Shrek, and our parks. So when you see those green areas, that's really, we're trying to establish little buffers around some of those key feature areas that we think are going to be of particular importance to provide pedestrian accommodations. The other way in which we wanted to look at this is from a corridor level, focusing in on which corridors in particular are going to be of greatest importance for us to have pedestrian accommodations into the future. Some of these already have some pedestrian accommodations. In some instances, we may want to look at augmenting that. A classic example, and probably the example talked about the most in this, would be along Market Street in downtown area. We do have sidewalks currently. However, there's some concern and some nervousness about crossings, crossing times, ease of crossings. How can we make that a little bit more pleasant and make it something where, to kind of continue the idea that Jake put forward, people park once and stay in the downtown area. So that's a particular location we've actually circled. We have an inset of that area in the report where we've circled certain locations we think that pedestrian crossings should be enhanced along that corridor. But really, in any of these roads that we have highlighted, we do believe that those are going to be key connection points for some of our pedestrian users in the area. We also tried to think about our pedestrian and bicycle priorities. Thinking about not only the facilities themselves, but also are there programs or policies that we could continue to advance that would help support this. things like the Greenway expansion supporting that, that may be something that's, again, a state priority. If we can express support for that here locally, that may help speed that initiative. You have some railroad crossings that don't have a very inviting pedestrian crossing environment, just to put that nicely. And that's a place that we may want to look at making some improvements there. Also, I have noted on here a comprehensive pedestrian plan. This is an opportunity for y'all if you're thinking about what is the next step in terms of a study for the area. DOT actually has a bicycle and pedestrian planning grant program that you can apply for either a bicycle plan or a pedestrian plan. They will provide the bulk of the funding, the town provides a match, and then you would have a standalone plan that gets to look at this in a greater level of detail than what we get to in just an overarching transportation plan. So that could be a really nice next step for you guys. Thinking about it a little bit further out, downtown plan, again, it would take in not only some of those pedestrian and bicycle issues, but also how do they interface with some of the land use concerns that we've been talking about. And then thinking very long term, because we wouldn't be doing our job if we didn't look out on into the future, there could be some opportunities. We have some changes with new interstates coming online, with other major facilities being realigned or changed in some way. There may be an opportunity to look at US 70 business maybe altering from its current alignment, possibly following something like Deerwood Stevenson, or another facility, maybe it locates out entirely. The reason why we would do that is to think about the downtown area in a manner that we could reallocate some of that corridor space and maybe have a little bit larger accommodations, whether it be for parking, expanded pedestrian or bicycle facilities, and less reliance up that roadway by trucks. So our final step in this was to think about our priorities for roadways as well. And we're very deliberate in the way that we phrase this. We have a near term, midterm, and long term. What you will not see are years associated with those. There's a lot of projects on here. We have, I think, about $100 million in current year dollars of projects in our near term. Now, does that mean that you're going to get $100 million of projects done in the next 5 to 10 years? No, no, it does not. What this really does is this is a tool for you all. You're going to be communicating with the state. You're going to be communicating with your RPO about which corridors are your priorities, which intersections are your priorities for improvement. And this allows you to kind of have that starting point of saying, hey, you know, it may be this grouping that we want to move forward with first, because they have their own priority systems. They're going to be scoring out those projects at the state level. So you want to make sure that you only submit those projects that are of greatest importance to you right now. So that's what this prioritization process is intended to achieve. And again, it does feature that mix of projects when you start to see intersections, access management, a lot of different things going on there to kind of get the ball rolling, make the best use of some available funds. One nice thing is you're already starting to make progress on this. Equity Drive is listed as just one of our examples we had identified for modernization, and that's something that has been talked about by this group as well. So it's exciting to see the momentum that's already there. And then we have our midterm and our long-term projects, which is where you start to see some of the higher dollar projects for sure starting to get featured there. So this can, like I said, just be a tool for you guys to use, not just with NCTUT, but also with the development community if you're working with folks on some of these roadways. And then finally, we have just overarching policy and program recommendations as well. One of the things that we heard from NCDOT at our most recent steering committee meeting is as you start to look at facilities, whether it be 301 or another, where you may be looking at a widening projects or an access management project that could include a median, it's helpful to have that conversation in advance about what the town's appetite is for the inclusion of a median, and possibly even resulting in a resolution of support if that is the way the town feels about a certain project. And what that does is that ultimately reduces the amount of public outreach time, or I guess iterations that may be needed as it actually progresses into a DOT project, and it's a higher likelihood that it will advance in the form that the town wants it to advance in. Town staff is already serving as a conduit to NCDOT to talk about traffic signal concerns. We brought this into the documentation simply to bring it to folks' attention. Our traffic signals are NCDOT maintained in the town of Smithfield, and so it's very important to have that communication from our citizens to the town staff so that they can pass on any concerns to DOT. This is a little bit outside our study area, but there's both commuter rail and an extension of Amtrak service being considered in Selma. This is something that the town of Smithfield could choose to issue a resolution of support or otherwise kind of show that they were interested in that, as it would provide another option close to this area for additional types of transportation. And then I think I've already talked about the pedestrian planning grant and then also updating those street design standards. So at long last, I think we've regaled you with all of the things that we had on our agenda. And I think we'd be happy to take any questions or comments that y'all may have.